Now let's turn to the war in Ukraine, or should we say war in Russia, because now it's Russian territory that's under attack. The Belgorod region near the Ukraine border has been in news. Since last month, it has repeatedly come under attack. These attacks are being carried out by people who say they are Russians. At least two groups have taken responsibility. They say the goal is to free Russia from the tyranny of President Vladimir Putin. Moscow doesn't believe it. The Kremlin says the attackers are actually Ukrainians, that Kiev is conducting a terrorism campaign inside Russia. Ukraine, of course, denies the charge, even though the Belgorod attackers seem to be aligned with Ukraine's goals. Our next report brings you the details.
These are drone videos shot in Russia's Belgorod region. They were released yesterday. They claim to show Russian military equipment being destroyed. The videos were released by a group calling itself the Freedom of Russia Legion. It put out this message as well.
Friends, fighters of the Russian Volunteer Corps are fighting once again on the territory of the Russian Federation. Very soon they'll be on the edge of Shebekino. Unfortunately, we can't provide evacuation of civilians from border regions as the army of the Russian Federation is shelling those areas and hindering the evacuation. Stay in your houses. Don't worry, the fighters of the Russian Volunteer Corps don't fight against civilians.
The town he's talking about, Shebekino, is a border town in Russia's Belgorod region. It was indeed attacked yesterday. Russia confirmed it, but it had a different narrative.
Shebekino district has been under continuous attack from the Ukrainian armed forces. 8 people have been injured. Nobody has been killed. The enemy has not been and is not at this time on the territory of Belgorod region. The Russian armed forces, border force, Federal Security Service, Federal National Guard troops service are on scene. A massive attack is ongoing. The lives of local people, primarily in Shebekino and nearby villages, are in danger.
The Belgorod region's governor says the town was attacked by the Ukrainian armed forces. He insisted that there were no enemy troops on the ground. Russia's defense ministry also said the same thing.
Thanks to active operations by the border defense units of the Western Military District and FSB of Russia, the terrorist formations of the Kiev regime sustained heavy losses and have been repelled. Any breakthroughs of the state border have been prevented.
He says no one broke through the state border. That's at odds with what the Freedom of Russia Legion claims. So, who do we believe? It's a bit complicated, because everyone has a motive to lie. Moscow would face embarrassment if it admits that fighters entered its territory. Kiev cannot admit to attacking Russian land. That's one of the conditions for receiving Western weapons. They can only be used for defense. So, Ukraine can't take credit. And it never has. Kiev always says that any attacks inside Russia have been conducted by Russian dissidents, that Russian citizens are fed up of the regime and fighting back. That's exactly the narrative the Freedom of Russia Legion is sticking to.
The
Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps are part of Ukraine's Foreign Legion, which is controlled by the Ukrainian military. When Russian fighters, volunteers, are on the territory of Ukraine, they are part of the Ukrainian armed forces. But when Russian armed fighters go home, then the chain of command no longer applies to them. These are simply Russian fighters. It is not a Ukrainian operation. It is an operation of Russian volunteers, resistance fighters.
He admits that they are working with Ukraine, that Kiev gives them orders, but the group becomes an independent unit when it enters Russia. That's quite convenient. But even if the command structure is murky, even if the group didn't enter Russia like the Kremlin claims, there's no doubt about one thing: Russia is under attack. Belgorod has become a hotspot. The fight has entered Russian territory. The so-called special military operation is now an all-out war.
If you're on Twitter, you know this next story, Joe Biden's great fall. I'm not speaking metaphorically, this actually happened. The US president was in Colorado on Thursday. He was attending a graduation ceremony at the US Air Force Academy. He handed out diplomas. He spoke to the graduates. But afterwards, this happened. Take a look. There was a sandbag next to Biden. He tripped on it and fell on stage. Could have happened to anyone. But when you're 80 years old and running for re-election, you are not just anyone. And that's Biden's problem. Republicans have repeatedly questioned his physical and mental ability. They say he is unfit for office. And the president himself has not helped his cause. He has mixed up people in public events, forgotten names.
And I want to thank all of you here for including bipartisan elected officials like Representative Governor, Senator Braun, Senator Booker, Representative Jackie. Are you here? Where's Jackie? I didn't think she was going to be here.
And also fallen off a cycle.
Hey, Dr. Martin, how was your anniversary?
These are things that can happen to the best of us. They don't disqualify Biden, but in the United States, presidential health is a political lightning rod. Donald Trump faced his share of criticism. Biden is now facing his. The White House says the president is unhurt. This is how Biden himself reacted to the fall.
I got sandbags. No breaking. Go.
He says he got sandbagged, but far-right commentators are not buying it. They say Biden should retire from politics. And what about the Republicans? What are they saying? Well, that's the surprise. Donald Trump spoke at a rally on Thursday. He addressed Joe Biden's fall, but not in a way you would expect. Listen to this.
He actually fell down. Well, I hope he wasn't hurt. I hope he wasn't hurt. But it's the whole thing is, look, the whole thing is crazy. You got to be careful about that. You got to be careful about that because you don't want that. Even if you have to tiptoe down a ramp, you got to tiptoe. It's like an ice skate.
How about that? No nasty dig at his health, no insulting comments. Trump is hoping Biden was not hurt. What explains this? Well, Trump himself is in the same boat as Biden. He's 76 years old, and there have been multiple concerns about his health too. Let me show you what happened in 2020. Donald Trump was attending a similar graduation event at West Point. Look at how he walked down the ramp afterwards. That incident was highly scrutinized. So will this one involving Biden. After all, it's a public issue. The president is the most powerful person in the United States, perhaps even the world. So their health will always be political. And to make matters worse, both these leaders are older than their predecessors. Biden will be 86 if he completes a second term. Trump will be 82. Do you know what the average retirement age in the US is? Around 62. So should the person with the nuclear codes be 80? That's a choice for Americans to make. But I think the largest story here isn't the fall. That could have happened to anyone. The largest story is the disconnect between American leaders and voters. The median age in the US is 38. Biden and Trump are more than twice that. They clashed once in 2020 for the presidency. Chances are they will clash again in 2024. What does that tell you about US politics? That it remains a club for old white men. I know experience is important in politics, but at what point does experience become a generational burden? I would say right about now. The median age of US president has been 55 when they took office. Biden is 80, Trump is 76. That rise is what America should be talking about, not Joe Biden's fall. On to the United States now. The Biden administration is needling China again. this time with a trade deal with Taiwan. It was signed yesterday. Taiwan has called the pact historic. They say this is the most comprehensive in 4 decades. What do they get out of it? The goal of the pact is to boost trade by streamlining customs checks, improving regulatory procedures, and by establishing anti-corruption measures. China is not liking this one bit. It has sent across this warning.
The so-called initiative is nothing but a pretext for economic and trade cooperation from the US, using a baton of taking and seizing from Taiwan. It is a proxy for the Taiwan DPP authorities to betray the vital interests of Taiwan compatriots and enterprises and harm and sell Taiwan for their own gain. This is the latest example of the US trying to hollow out the One China principle.
The outrage is genuine. China's reaction is on expected lines. Taiwan is a touchy issue. Beijing says the trade deal is a threat to its sovereignty, since it sees Taiwan as a breakaway province. Beijing has vowed to reclaim the island, and it doesn't rule out using force. In recent years, these tensions have only risen, mainly because of the actions by the United States. Last year, Nancy Pelosi's visit deteriorated the situation. Back then, she was the Speaker of the US House of Representatives. So she became the highest-ranking US official to visit the island in 35 years. China had condemned this visit. It had called the visit extremely dangerous. Beijing responded with provocative drills around the island. The PLA launched ballistic missiles. Some of them even flew over the island. There was stern diplomatic response too. The US-China relationship hasn't recovered since then. There are virtually no diplomatic exchanges. US has tried to resume dialogue, but China refuses to talk. Now we have a trade deal with Taiwan. Is it a counterproductive move? Well, it seems like it. While the accord is a first, since 1979, the pact falls short of a comprehensive trade agreement. The deal is limited in scope. It fails to address several key issues like tariffs on traded goods and double taxation, which is a pain point for Taipei. So the agreement will have a narrow impact, and it risks raising tensions with China. Is this even worth it? Biden's priority was to manage differences with China and avoid a conflict under any circumstances. In fact, a few days ago, he said, "We'll witness a thaw soon." Listen it.
At the Bali conference, that's what the President Xi and I agreed we were going to do and meet on. And then this silly balloon that was carrying 2 freight cars worth of spine equipment was flying over the United States, and it got shot down, and everything changed in terms of talking to one another. I think you're going to see that begin to thaw very shortly.
Well, it has not happened yet. Instead, the hostilities are rising. Just listen to what Blinken said today.
So Russia's aggression hasn't distracted us from meeting the challenges in the Indo-Pacific. It's actually sharpened our focus on them. And our support for Ukraine hasn't weakened our capabilities to meet potential threats from China or anywhere else. It's strengthened them.
Blinken says US will no longer be intimidated by China. Instead, it will take the challenge head on. Are we headed towards a conflict? Well, we hope not, but the Cold War is intensifying. Hopes of a dialogue were dashed recently. China declined an invite from the US Defense Secretary. He wanted to meet his Chinese counterpart this week. Blinken and US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen were hoping to meet their counterparts too. Now again, no dates have been set. Instead, the West's resolve to contain China is getting stronger. Last month, the G7 leaders called out Beijing. They issued their strongest condemnation yet. They said the military, economic and security threats from China are rising. Serious concerns were expressed over the PLA's activities in the East and South China Sea. So the divisions are getting wider and the relationship more frosty. Forget about managing differences. The US and China are on a collision course, and the rest of us have reason to worry. Now, what comes to your mind when you think of Bali? Turquoise blue waters, scenic beaches, buzzing nightclubs, essentially the perfect tourist destination. Bali relies heavily on tourism. People visit the island from across the world. But what happens when these tourists become unruly? Bali is reeling from a number of shocking tourist scandals and has now issued a list of do's and don'ts. Our next report tells you all about this travel advisory. If you're traveling to Bali anytime soon, make sure to keep this in mind.
Tourist deported over a nude photo on sacred tree. German tourist strips naked at Bali temple performance. Bali tourist arrested after exposing genitals. For the island of gods, that is some ungodly behavior. Bali is known for its beaches and parties, but it looks like unruly tourists are its Achilles heel. From tourists dancing naked at temples to some even exposing themselves on public transport, the island nation is dealing with a lot of unruly tourists, and the Hindu-majority island is worried about this growing trend. So Bali has issued a new set of rules, a list of do's and don'ts for foreign tourists. The list may sound generic, like respect for sacred spaces in the country, politeness, complying with traffic rules, etc. But the don'ts is where Bali is putting its foot down. The list is long and specific. No trespassing on sacred land. No climbing sacred trees. No engaging in behavior that defiles sacred places. No use of single-use plastics. No uttering offensive words and acting aggressively towards others. And not engaging in work without proper permits. Bali relies heavily on tourism. The COVID-19 pandemic hit the island's economy heavily. So, Bali is trying to bring tourism back to the island. But at what cost? Income from foreigners is crucial, but what about Bali's culture? Its own sacred heritage and customs. What happens when tourists cannot respect that? That is the question Bali is grappling with right now. Authorities, however, seem to have had enough. Unruly tourists have become the norm, and the new advisory aims to curb this. They're also contemplating a bike ban. They plan to ban tourists and other foreigners renting motorbikes. So, if riding a bike through Bali's paddy fields was on your travel list, it could soon remain just a dream. But if you're heading to Bali anytime soon, remember two things: respect the rules and have fun.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with Texas, where flash floods have inundated entire highways. In Jerusalem, thousands descended on the streets to celebrate Pride Month. This is the first Pride March held under the hard-right Netanyahu government. In Jordan, royal wedding bells are ringing. Crown Prince Hussein married Rajwa Al Saif, a Saudi architect. Royals and the heads of states from across the world attended this grand wedding. What makes June 2nd significant? Taking you back in history, on this day in 1953, Queen Elizabeth II was crowned at London's Westminster Abbey. It was the first coronation to be televised. Millions watched the proceedings on live television for the first time. Queen Elizabeth II went on to become the longest reigning monarch in British history. And watch Flashback with Palki Sharma on Saturday at 8 p.m. India time.
For centuries, Tibet and China had coexisted. They fought, they made up. But they never tried to crush each other's spirit. That changed in 1949 when communists took over China. Mao Zedong unleashed fury on his neighbor. He burned down monasteries, slaughtered soldiers, and executed monks. Catch the story of Tibet's invasion on Flashback.
We leave you with this. Thank you so much for watching.
Upon the high altar had been placed the coronation regalia, whose central piece is the crown of St. Edward, placed upon the head of the sovereign at the actual ceremony of crowning. With becoming...
Poor people. So this is West Texas. I'm about, and it's completely washed. Two vehicles right up to the side, and it's pushed.
Selfie.
and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.